'n Voorstel is onlangs voor die parlementêre portefeuljekomitee oor handel, nywerheid en mededinging gemaak, wat die motorbedryf op sy kop kan keer. Volgens hierdie voorstel kan Suid-Afrika 'n invoertarief van tot 50% op goedkoop voertuie uit China en India hef. British American Tobacco Suid-Afrika het ook vroeër aangekondig dat hy sy plaaslike vervaardiging gaan stop. Vanaand vra ons, doen die regering genoeg om plaaslike vervaardiging te beskerm? Om dit te beantwoord, sê die vakverbondbaas Zwelinzima Vavi, 'n verteenwoordiger van die motorbedryf Sakeraad namens Tshetlhe Litheko en die ontleder Khaya Sithole by my aan. Tshetlhe, I want to start with you. The proposal of this tariff, why is the industry against it?
So there are two sort of challenges that you need to appreciate. So one, we're not talking about what we call a safeguard measure. So a safeguard measure would be one that's specific to one economy, where you're saying there's a skewed balance in the economy stemming from one economy sending products our way. In this case, maybe China is an example. But we're talking about using a bond rate, which is an arrangement that allows us to go up to a certain amount of tariffs or duties, as we call them in South Africa. And WTO will not frown on us because we've agreed that we could have up to 50% in these particular trades. But when you implement it, it's implemented across the board. So it would then include vehicles that otherwise we are not producing locally. And so you're not necessarily protecting South Africa against, for instance, cheaper, so when I say cheaper, I mean affordable vehicles for our community that's already cash stranded and households that are already trying to figure out how to exist there. So industry is against necessarily, we need to be safeguarded, but it needs to be deliberate, it needs to be designed in a way that it encourages local production. And in the way that it's pronounced now, it's going to have universal application, and the consequences of that universal application, unfortunately, could actually threaten the very industry that we're trying to protect.
I mean, the word tariff has become a buzzword this year. It's a way to sort of punish you know, the ones who are bringing in, or the companies that are bringing in these products, the cheaper vehicles from China and India in this case. But what should the government rather be doing to promote local production?
Well, I think one of the big problems is a simple question of why perhaps companies have opted not to produce locally. So if you go to these particular companies and then you say to them, look, when you started your production, what were the input costs and what has happened to those particular input costs? And if those input costs have become so problematic, they've eroded their margins, and these companies say, well, it's actually better off to go offshore and then bring these vehicles back in, then you at least know what it is that the type of problem that you're dealing with. I think in the South African context, unfortunately, we do not do enough of that granular detail to be able to understand that, well, perhaps if the input cost when it comes to electricity, for example, is what the problem statement is, then how do you intervene there so that these companies can come back and say, look, we still have a viable case for actually producing in South Africa, so therefore we'll stay. And of course, as was mentioned earlier on, the tariff approach does indeed have unintended consequences. And in instances where people say we can't afford cars at all, well, then at the end of the day, the consumers, just like the American consumers have learned to discover, consumers ultimately bear the burden of the tariffs. And I think obviously when we are considering this, we have to be very clear about what the intention is and whether it is indeed should be a tariff regime that is targeted towards those countries that perhaps are seen to be flooding the market and are able to benefit from particular market distortions. That is what the conversation should be focusing on.
Mr. Vavi, you've warned that South Africa is in danger of becoming a warehouse economy. In the event of British American Tobacco, they've said that they are still going to be selling their products in South Africa but not producing them. So that's a whole lot of jobs that we have lost now, and also in the case of some of these cars coming in but not being produced in South Africa. What are the dangers of that?
Well, we are worried that we may be losing the battle here, because if you look at it from the historic context of what has been happening since after 1994, you will see that we are actually dealing with a trend here. Initially in 1994, we frowned, we protested, but we didn't have instruments to stop this trend. When the light manufacturers started to move production out of South Africa, literally into the neighboring countries such as Lesotho, Swaziland, where they were producing the stoves, the kettles, the televisions, and sending them back into South Africa. We should have listed this higher in the priorities of our engagement and protest against the South African government, which in our view slept on duty throughout. So we have no light goods manufacturing left in South Africa, hardly anything left. Then the next was the clothing and textile shoes industry. We complained on that one. We protested. We looked at the unfair trade balance between South Africa and China. We complained that this was equal to dumping finished goods. We complained about the extent of our customs being compromised by corruption, in that it was possible to just continuously, without paying any duties, getting stuff into South Africa. At the end, when you now in Salt River, in Newcastle, in Ispingo, in parts of Durban and Pietermaritzburg, even in some parts of the Eastern Cape, in Port Elizabeth, in Timbaza, where I come from, in Sada, you're walking into a possibility of ghost town. Ghost towns, literally, in that those factories that were producing those clothing are gone. Now we're speaking about the new threat.
I want to ask you just on that point, talk about these ghost towns. Khaya spoke about electricity costs. To what extent does labour costs contribute to this problem? That these products can be manufactured in China for a fraction of the cost in terms of labour, in terms of paying people wages. And it's not to say that people should not be earning a living wage, but how do you compete with countries that are able to pay their workers peanuts?
It's going to be a tough call now in relation to the automobiles. Obviously, the automobiles is regarded as one of the most stable manufacturing capacity South Africa have developed over many decades, and they do pay decent wages to workers, and they can never compete when it comes to low wages with China, for example, which is heavily subsidized, which have no culture of internal democracy, of independent trade unions, which have heavy subsidized companies by the state, and so that overproduction in China can easily become a problem of dumping into South Africa and the rest of the world. And before you know it, you will end up, if you don't use the tariffs and all of the interventions that are needed to prop up the South Africa's manufacturing capacity in terms of your ability to just build cars, you will end up having the problem of finished cars coming into South Africa, with them not building local factories here, and therefore not creating jobs here in South Africa, which becomes then a very big problem.
Tshetlhe, I just want to ask you on that point. Is it possible, is it realistic for us to expect that we can compete with China, specifically when it comes to these cheaper cars? And consumers have gotten used to it. So it's going to be difficult to get consumer sympathy for this cause.
Yeah, so I think we need to be deliberate about several things. So there are areas of vehicle manufacturing where South Africa can say we do have some advantage over, say, other markets. For instance, we are in LCV market, light commercial vehicle market, what we call the bakkie. And in that bakkie segment, there are very serious concessions that we could do in trade, in some of the tools that are available to the industry to make sure that that competitiveness continues to thrive. We are already producing above 2% of global production in those particular vehicles. And in terms of the African terrain as well, in terms of how well we do business with adjacent markets, South Africa is not necessarily done. It's and I don't want to put it on South Africa. I really want to put it on how regional integration and economic integration for product flow north of our country has slowed down for various reasons that we now need to accelerate. South Africa sent last year in 2025 80% of its production to the EU. Now it's a market that's 5 days away from us on a boat. And so anything that happens in that market, so for instance, if CBAM codes are adjusted, it would affect the type of product and the availability of that market for the cars we produce. And so it's also in how we have these free trade areas and how well we negotiate a market for the products that we produce. And if you factor that into the equation and you say who then has speed to those markets and how well that speed is executed, you'd find that South Africa does also have a market pathway that puts it at an advantage above China, who also has to do an 8-day boat ride to supply into Africa, for instance. And so how well we position ourselves for the region is important to then get into that competitive advantage conversation.
Guy, I want to ask you basically the same question. It's a difficult political decision for government to make because, like I said, consumers love paying less for cars, clothes, even cigarettes in some instances, even when they know that those cigarettes are illicit. How should government handle this?
I just think it's problematic when it's cigarettes because, I mean, you could die from them. But yeah, I do think that obviously there is this political tension, particularly if you're looking at the volumes that are coming from India and China, and whether the government in its current iteration would have the presence of mind to say, well, actually, we think that these imbalances are fatal to our prospects as a country. And I think if you then try and figure out whether the government will be able to say to those particular trade partners that, guys, we've got this particular problem, we need to be able to implement this tariff as a stopgap measure to actually stop the bleeding in our own economy. If they had the courage to do that, then perhaps we could see the conversation moving forward. I don't know if we have the political will to actually have these very difficult conversations, because you would think that if we're sitting around the table in China representing the Chinese Communist Party, they'd be very clear about what is required in order to solve the Chinese problem, and that will be implemented and everyone else has to work around it.
Tshetlhe, I see you want to add something.
Yeah, I wanted to say that perhaps a layer in defense of government is that government needs to take such decisions if it can prove damage. Remember, we are in a rule-based trade arrangement with the rest of the world, unlike, say, the United States that can throw tariffs without proving any damage. And so, to what extent can our government then do a safeguard on the basis that work has been done to prove that there is damage? And so that work also needs to be allowed to be executed in order to get to a conclusion that a safeguard measure needs to be introduced. And it's a separate conversation, though, before we say government is sleeping on the job.
Sure, but Mr. Vavi, do you think there is political will for our government to in some instances, really go up against these
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to be harder on the government in this instance. They're sleeping on the job. They slept on the job when the first signals were showing red lights that we're going to lose the light manufacturing capacity in South Africa. They slept on the job when they allowed the dumping of clothing, textile and shoes from the East, and often manufactured in sweatshops economies, which have no recognition, respect for human rights and worker rights, and therefore have an unfair advantage over South Africa. They're sleeping on the job even now with the tobacco crisis. The fact that 75% of all what you see in the shops is illicitly produced within South Africa. 75%, meaning that your legal market is left with only 25%. The government's political will should mean better enforcement capacities. And it's not just about tobacco, by the way. It goes to the issue of health. Yes, last year or year before last year, we had a crisis of kids dying in the townships consuming goods that should never be mixed up with children and all of that. It goes to the fact that there is no capacity to enforce local government bylaws. The South Africans healthcare have very strict rules about how you handle food and how you sell it, in particular to the rest of the public. Once you have the state that collapses in terms of that capacity to enforce, then the whole economy becomes vulnerable. And that's why we are calling for two measures. Firstly, enforce. Secondly, don't allow anybody to sell goods that are not produced in South Africa.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.